Hello, I want to welcome everyone. I'm Betty Casey. I'm editor of TulsaKids magazine. And we partnered with OSU Tulsa and the Tri-Cities Collective to bring you a series entitled, a series of conversations entitled Dismantling Racism. Today, we're going to talk about religion and maybe some cultural aspects of traditions and also the holiday and how that impacts all of us, I think. Before I introduce our moderator and the panel, I want to remind all of you that you can join the conversation by asking questions or making comments by using your chat feature, and you can do that live. And we'll include those comments throughout the conversation. So first I want to introduce our moderator today, Quraysh Lansana. He is the author of 20 books in poetry, nonfiction, and children's literature. He's a Tulsa Artist Fellow, writer in residence, and adjunct professor at Oklahoma State University, Tulsa. He's a former faculty member of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Juilliard School. Lansana is executive producer of KOSU NPR's Focus, Black Oklahoma, and his forthcoming titles include Those Who Stayed, Live in 1921 Tulsa After the Massacre, and Opal's Greenwood Oasis, which is an amazing children's book. He is a member of Tri-City Collective. Okay, and I will start with our panelists. We have Imam Mohamed Herbert. Welcome. He was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. At the age of 12, he completed his pronouncing. Okay.
Memorization of the Quran. Feel free to use the translation.
Memorization of the Quran. Thank you. And this shows how much education I need, and I apologize. The Islamic Society of Baltimore. He later moved to Irving, Texas to learn Arabic and continued his studies. He graduated in 2014 and began his service as the Imam of the Mansfield Islamic Center. He continued his studies full-time at Colum while still serving as the Imam. After graduation, he moved to Tulsa, where he currently serves as the youth director and assistant Imam for the community. So welcome to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to introduce Rabbi Lillian Kowalski. She's originally from Albany, New York. Rabbi Lilly was ordained in 2019 from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. She holds an MA in Jewish education from the Rhea Hirsch School of Education of Hebrew Union College and a BA in Judaic Studies, Music, and Women and Gender Studies from Brandeis University in Massachusetts. Her published graduate school work focused on the intersection of the creative arts and sacred texts, as well as the power of language in influencing our relationships. Sounds so interesting. She has worked with dozens of organizations and different Jewish organizations around the country, from New York and California to Washington and Arizona. She currently serves as one of the rabbis and director of education at Temple Israel in Tulsa. So welcome to you, Rabbi.
Thank you for having me.
And then we have Reverend Amy Venable, who also is my neighbor. She's a native Tulsan and a graduate of Booker T. She studied French and International Studies at Washington University in St. Louis and spent a year abroad at the University de Caen in France. She has a Master of Divinity from Perkins School of Theology at SMU in Dallas. She was the senior pastor at St. Stephen's United Methodist Church in Norman for 7 years and served as primary and middle school chaplain at Holland Hall. She is now minister of pastoral care in Boston Avenue United Methodist Church here in Tulsa. And interesting fact, I didn't know this about Amy, she's ridden across the state 7 times on Oklahoma Freewheel. And she also, I did know this, has a sister in her home staying with her who's in the national tour of Frozen, who was frozen out of being in the national tour because of COVID. So she has an interesting you probably have some music over at your house, Amy, I would assume.
Yes,
Welcome, Amy. Thank you for being here.
thank you.
And finally, last but not least, we have Christy Williams. She is a great-great-granddaughter of Creek Friedman, 1874 Supreme Court Justice Jesse Franklin, and also the great-granddaughter of Cherokee citizens Lily Van and Abraham Mayberry, a World War I veteran. She's a community activist, advocate, and organizer, a political consultant and campaign manager for Tulsa's District 1 Councilor Vanessa Hall Harper, as well as author of Healing Me for Me, that was published in 2015. She serves as chairperson of the Greater Tulsa African American Affairs Commission and is a member and organizer of the 1921 Tulsa Mass Graves Investigation Committee. Her previous affiliations as a chair to Tulsa's Coalition for Social Justice spearheaded the efforts to rename the Brady District and prevailed. In 2014, she was awarded Community Activist of the Year from the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. She has been featured speaker for YWCA Stand Against Racism campaign, Embrace Yourself Foundation, as well as a panelist for race relations and activism and advocacy. She's worked with LeBron James, Spring Hill Company, and CNN Films documentary Dreamland, The Rise and Fall of Black Wall Street, and is currently working on a documentary with PBS about Greenwood. She remains driven and encouraged to speak out against injustices on all fronts, and we welcome you as well. So thank you to this amazing panel, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. So Q, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Betty, and welcome everyone. And as promised in your traditions, Alafia and Assalamu alaikum, Shalom, and peace be with you. Now, I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
fantastic.
Okay, very good. All right. Maybe you just went quiet for a second because of the weight and the enormity of those words that I just dropped on you. So, but perhaps not. So I'm going to throw you a curve for a second. I know we're going to get to the origin studies. Yeah, I'm known to do that. We're going to get to the origin stories, and the mo of the discussion will center on your practices and this place in which we reside that perpetuates in many ways misunderstandings, misconceptions, ignorance about your paths, about your faiths, about your practices. But I want to begin with something that that I read yesterday in the Washington Post that I think really sort of speaks to where we are and what we're going to dive into as a panel. And I'm really interested in your collective thoughts on this quote. So this is a quote from the Reverend William H. Lamar IV, who is the pastor of the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington. And just for a bit of background, that church was vandalized over the weekend by members of the Proud Boys and white militia groups. And a Black Lives Matter was taken from the front of the church, paraded down to the Black Lives Matter plaza, and then stomped on and set on fire. Here's a quote from an op-ed piece that the Reverend published yesterday. This new narrative must question everything if we are serious about imagining a better world. The media, academia, and religious institutions alike often behave as if American capitalism was decreed by the divine. The economic infrastructure of this nation generates inhumane inequality. Religious fundamentalists believe in individual sin while turning a blind eye to the sinfulness of an economic system that forces working people to pay more of their income in taxes while refusing to pay them living wages, that deprives them of health care and humane retirements. And all this happens while the rich grow richer. What I know that passage and the entire piece is worth reading, but that passage really struck me, and particularly because I knew I was going to be hanging out with you brilliant folks for the next hour. after I read it. So I'm interested in your thoughts. What spoke to you about that quote? What resonated, if anything, for you? So you can speak up, or I can start picking on you.
This is exactly how I speak in my classrooms too.
Hey, I'm telling you.
I'll leave the floor to someone to go before me. There's a whole lot of educated people in this room.
Okay, I'm going to start picking on people now.
I will say,
Go ahead.
I will say, I happen to have a friend and colleague. We were both in seminary together, different seminaries, but we met at an interreligious discussion group. And he's in DC, and so he has been very hands-on with this since it happened. And you know, I think it's really important in some of these conversations to acknowledge. So in acknowledging, so first of all, I want to say hi to my friend Delante, because he's a wonderful pastor in DC. But to acknowledge that there's a lot of historical resonance with some of these issues. Part of what that quote speaks to goes all the way back to the historical foundations of the United States. And we really do have to be, as we're learning and becoming more aware of our past, and you know, and even the brief conversations that we were having before we went live about, you know, what does it mean to look at our past, and previously having swept it under the rug and now bringing it out into light, and really being able to be honest about what some of that is. I think that was one thing that I really pulled from that quote, is being honest about some of the origins of the United States, and that idea of economic success being also in some ways connected with divine recognition. That's a really tough concept, but it is very ingrained in our history. And as we are seeing so much nowadays, and especially, you know, with, as like I said, as we were talking about before, with the centenary of the race massacres coming up, we really need to be aware of how our history has shaped our present, and is that really the story we want to be telling moving forward, right? History is written by the victors, history is written by the successful, history is written by the rich. Is that really the story that we want to be perpetuating moving forward? And we have an opportunity to be able to say, no, we need to be more aware of our history. We need to be aware of these pieces about our local and national history. I will say in some of these pieces, I was watching the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that was involved in the parade was a Native American land acknowledgement, which was the first time that had happened in the parade, and I was so grateful to be able to be standing there in front of my television watching that happen. That was a piece of history to celebrate, and I think that's what's getting what part of that quote is getting at, that we have a chance right now, as we are becoming more aware, to give that history a new face and a new platform and a new light.
Thank you, Rabbi. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Just to kind of build on what Rabbi was mentioning. First of all, amazing points. And from the Islamic perspective, from the Muslim perspective, there's a few points that come to mind, or actually 2 points that come to mind. The first thing is, you know, as the Rabbi was mentioning, you know, we look back in our history in the United States of America, and we look back to, you know, separation of church and state. When you have these realities that kind of come into play, then my belief, and God knows best, is that we tend to then dictate what our morality is, right? We, as human beings, we then dictate our morality. That's what happens when we don't take our morality or our ethics from a higher power. Then it just becomes my opinion versus your opinion. And as you mentioned, you have this reality of capitalism, of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, because there's no need to, if life is all about subjective morality and ethics, then as long as I'm getting better, then who cares about the other person, right?
Right.
And so when we speak about this concept, when we speak about this idea of economic justice, this falls so deeply in line with what the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, taught us as Muslims about what it means to stand up for justice. When the Prophet Muhammad walks into the city of Medina for the first time, so they were in the city of Mecca, and they were kicked out. They were tortured, they were ostracized, and they were kicked out, and they fled from their homes, and they went to a neighboring city of Medina. And when the Prophet ﷺ goes into Medina, the overwhelming majority of the population there is Muslim. So he naturally becomes a natural ruler. But there is a big Jewish community as well as some polytheists that are still there as well. But when he walks in, the statement that he makes is so powerful. He doesn't walk in and say that, everyone should be praying all night long, as you would assume a religious leader would say. He doesn't walk into the community and say that, we need to convert everyone. That way we're all on the same page. He doesn't say that, The Prophet ﷺ walks in and he explains what it means to be a healthy community. He says, now I'm walking in as the leader of Medina. We want to have social justice in our community. This is what it's going to mean. It's going to start with, the Prophet says, Afshu salam, spread peace amongst one another. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who you are. Your first job from a communal level is going to be to spread peace, right? Do your job, do your best rather, to make sure that the person standing next to you always leaves your company with a positive interaction. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was known to smile all the time. There's actually a funny story about that. One of the companions used to narrate the different traditions that the Prophet taught him, right? And so one of the companions, he would narrate. His name was Abu Darda. And his wife, Darda, came up to him one time and she said, I need to talk to you. And he's like, what's up? She says that every time you start teaching the prophetic traditions, you smile. And I'm worried that people are going to start saying that you're crazy because you're always smiling. You look kind of rude, you're out here always smiling.
Right.
And Abu Darda, he looks to her and he says, my dear wife, I smile because I swear to you by God, I never stood in the presence of the Prophet except that he smiled at my face. And so the Prophet, he starts off, he says, Afshu salam, spread peace. But the very next statement is at'imu ta'am, feed food, which is a very interesting kind of verbiage, a very interesting way to say it. He doesn't say feed the needy. He says feed food to people. He says it doesn't matter if you're Muslim, if you're white, if you're black, if you're tall, if you're short, if you're skinny, if you're old, if you're young, it doesn't matter. That the Muslim doesn't go to sleep full knowing that someone in their neighborhood is hungry, that's inappropriate. And that kind of touches on this idea of economic equality, that we should all have equal access to our human necessities. Of course, natural growth, there's always going to be an economic difference. That's natural, right? If someone wants to, work hard on their business and grow their business and is craving that wealth, then, the power to you, right? But the problem is when there isn't equal opportunity for that gain. That's the problem. The problem is not that there's rich and poor. The problem is that we've blocked off the paths from our people. And when you don't have that social justice of, afshu salam, of spreading peace, and you don't have that communal justice of, feeding the needy, and you don't have that family justice. The next part of actually that equation is family justice, is taking care of your families and yourself. And then you have your spiritual justice, taking care of your relationship with God. You have this pie that's set, right? And if you don't have every one of these equal parts, then it's just not going to work. We can sit here and we can lecture our heads off about what it means to be just. But if a Black person in America, or if a Native American in America, or a Mexican in America doesn't have equal opportunity for a job or for livelihood, then it don't matter. You can stand there with a sign all day, So, but in any case, I think that's that's my spiel. But what I wanted to kind of the concluding point is, it's very much in line with what the prophet teaches us, and that is that social justice is not as simple as speaking up. Speaking up is only one part of it. Spreading peace to your neighbors is only one part of it. But economic justice is another equal part of it. And God knows best.
Thank you, Mom. Rev or Miss Christy, any thoughts on that?
That was absolutely beautiful, and when I'm just in awe of that. Oh gosh, that was beautiful. But when I thought of when you were reading that in the paper, hang on, guys, I'm sorry about that. So when you were reading that from the Washington Post, it made me think about our our flight as African Americans in this country. And there is a fact that right on the eve of the Civil War, Black people, we were slaves at that time. And maybe I think the number was like 237,000 Black people were actually free at the eve of the Civil War. And we only owned a half of 1% of the wealth in this country. A half of 1% of the wealth in this country. Imagine that. And then 2010, with all our degrees and somewhat opportunities, we still only owned a half of 1% of the wealth in this country.
Right.
Today in 2020, we own 1% of the wealth in this country. And that was with the Black president. That was with all our degrees. We haven't made much progress, and it just makes you realize that not only is poverty the new slavery, but it's to keep people down economically. That's capitalism, and it's bipartisan. And then we get caught up in these turf wars of who's Democrat, who's Republican, and they're both killing us at the same time. And so it makes me think of that when you read that passage from the Washington Post.
Which is interesting, and I'm going to circle back to that after we hear from Rev, about how you said it's bipartisan, Republican and Democrat, and I'm thinking about we're in a conversation with 4 faith spiritual leaders here. How can religion or spirituality, how can it move in that world and help change it? But let's hear from Rev first before we dive into that.
I'll try to keep it short. I'm sure you have other questions. I think about the expression that's prevalent in the South among Christians. If they don't like a sermon, especially if you start preaching about giving your money away, a parishioner will say, well, now you've quit preaching and gone to meddling. So especially during the pledge campaign time, when we're saying, okay, remember, we're supposed to give 10% to the church and all that. I've never actually had someone say, you've quit preaching and gone to meddling, but money is so sensitive. And certainly in Christianity of just middle America for the last 50 or 100 years, there's been a real separation between this idea of personal salvation, that I go to church just so that I'm going to go to heaven when I die. There's that kind of belief. And then there's this other belief that says we're supposed to take care of the poor because Jesus Christ actually said that, we believe. So we're supposed to create economic policies that are fair and help injustice to be eradicated. But it's a little easier and more comfortable just to think, well, I'm just going to think about me and God and my relationship with the Almighty, and everybody else just stay away and mind your own business. So that's a difficult thing that even in 2020, well-educated people sitting in the pews, people still think, well, not everybody, but there is a belief of, well, if people are having hard times, somehow they deserve it, or they've They haven't tried hard enough or something. So I feel like we all need to be more educated about that. We all need to be kind of woken up about that.
Thank you, Reverend. Betty, did a question come through?
We do have a question. Actually, this, before we move on to the next, this is a recap. Someone wants the Imam to recap on the social justice pie. Maybe someone's taking notes.
Yeah.
Community, economic, spiritual. So a little bit of what was the social justice pie?
Yeah, so this was the first address that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, gave the second he walked into Medina. And we said that it was community, economic, spiritual, and family justice, making sure that you can't have a healthy community if you don't have healthy families first, right? And actually, family is supposed to go before spiritual. So the idea is that you build healthy communities, and a healthy community, a result of that will be a healthy economy. And a healthy economy will help then lead healthy families. And you can't have healthy families if you don't have healthy individuals. And at the end of that narration, the Prophet Muhammad, he says, وَصَلُّوا بِاللَّيْلِ وَالنَّاسُ نِيَامٌ, which translates to, and pray at night while people are asleep. The translation, what that basically means is that your spiritual growth is personal. That's between you and God. It don't need to be on Instagram. It doesn't need to be on Snapchat. It doesn't need to be shoving down someone else's throat, not even your own family. It needs to be, you need to be praying at night. Have you asked God for forgiveness for your mistakes? But in any case, yeah, family is the last part of that pie. But speaking about what Brother Quraysh was saying, the question of, how do we, improve and how do we move forward, and what our religions can do to, change this idea of economic injustice. Islam talks about this in detail, in a lot of detail. And the truth of the matter is, what I can do in my community here today is simply advise. We don't have the power, the ability to change legislation and things like that, at least from what Islam asks of us. One example of that is, according to the Muslim faith, as Muslims, it is impermissible for us to take interest. Interest is absolutely forbidden, right? And the reason for that is because interest allows the rich to get richer and the poor to get poor. It takes advantage of people, right? That's one example. And this is the only place in the entire Quran where God says that if you do this, understand that you have waged war against me. Is taking interest. It's not in drinking. It's not in fornicating. It's not in not praying. It's not in leaving faith. That verbiage is used in interest, because as the Reverend was mentioning, when you mess with people's money, you walk in a slippery slope. You can't be messing with people's money, right? And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, he has another quote where he says, كَادَ الْفَقْرُ يَكُونُ كُفْرًا, which translates to, it is possible that poverty can be a form of disbelief, like it can lead you to disbelief. Because when you are unaware of what you're going to eat the next meal, you're not worried about your relationship with God. I mean, you're not worried about anything else. Like, I can't eat, and so, so one example of how, Islam has come to kind of eradicate this idea of economic injustice was, for example, abolishing this idea of interest, right? And the Quran teaches us that loans are supposed to be done out of goodwill. You don't give someone, $100 loan and tell them to pay you back 200. Then they don't make no money. You're pulling them out of one hole and putting them in another hole, right? So that's one idea. I mean, there are so many other concepts that are taught. I mean, the books that, we studied when we were in seminary about, these rulings of economic justices and things like that, they're very detailed, things like inheritance. The Quran dictates for us exactly how much every person should inherit, when someone else passes away, things like that. Another example of that is insurances. That's impermissible according to Islam. Of course, in America, we are mandated, as Muslims to get insurance, but it's not ideal for us, because the idea of insurance is that you're paying someone for a hypothetical. You're not receiving anything in return. You're paying and paying and paying and paying and paying and paying and paying on the off chance that something happens. That's completely impermissible in Islam. And we see what happens because of that. What are some of the most rich and filthy rich companies and organizations in our country? Our insurance companies and our banks. And they literally what Islam came and said, no, that's not okay. Because you create this cycle, right? Because they say in the business world, I studied business for a little bit, and I did a little business before I got into this whole Islamic studies. Money makes money, right? And so if you want to get rich, you got to get some more money. But where are you getting money from? Well, you're getting money from someone else who's rich, right? Well, that person who gave you money for you to get rich just got richer. And so in reality, what happens, your numbers are growing, absolutely, but their numbers are growing at an equal rate. And it becomes a reality of exactly what Mrs. Williams was mentioning. And that is, we live in a society here today where years and years and years and years and years and years after quote unquote justice, we haven't grown past 0.5%. Half of a percent, we haven't grown past it. Although the wealth of the country has grown exponentially. I mean, it's the reason why America is number one. It's not because we're the smartest country, not by a long shot. It's not because we're the healthiest country, also not by a long shot. It's not because we have the largest population, also not by a long shot. It's what? Because money talks. I mean, that's the world we live in. Let's be real with ourselves, right? But the problem is when we want to talk about justice within ourselves, we have to completely revamp the system. And so when you ask Mr. Quraysh about, how it is that we can move forward, how it is that my religion teaches me to fix this system or to change this system, as you mentioned, we change this, to make change and to help the system, you have to completely change it. Just like if there's a disease, there's the coronavirus, you got to kill the disease. It's not going to work if the disease is there. And so what I do as a community leader is I help teach my community to try to work around it. That if we live in a society that beats the poor down to the ground, well, guess what? What we need to be doing then is we need to be trying to give more charity. That's what we need to be doing. And is that more of a burden on you? Absolutely. But that's part of the reality of the blessing of wealth. God teaches us in the Quran that there are two different types that he will test a human being, right? There's a test of taking away. Whenever we think about a test from God, we think about God taking something away from us, right? Restricting your wealth, restricting your health. But God clearly states to us and teaches us in the Quran that there's a second type of test, and that test is of God giving you. Mm-hmm. And that test is harder than God holding back, because to be patient when you don't have nothing is your only option. You don't have no other option but to be patient. Right. So you tough it up. And that's the natural state of the human being, is we tough it up. We live through and we push through, right? That's how we are as a species. The harder test is being grateful and fulfilling the responsibility of the people in your community. The Prophet Muhammad says, on the day of judgment, me and the person who takes care of the orphans will be like this in paradise. Right. And I asked myself, and I actually just gave a sermon about this last Friday. That's why it's coming straight to my mind. But I asked myself and I asked my congregation, when it comes to Eid time, and now we're in, Hanukkah time and Christmas time, and when our celebrations come around and we think about ourselves and we think about our families and we think about our cars and we're thinking about our homes, honestly ask yourself, how many orphans do you know by name? Seriously, my teacher, he told us one time in one of our classes, he says, I don't want to see you post social justice stuff on Instagram. I don't care about that. What I want to know is if when you see a Black church is getting, vandalized, or when you see a synagogue that's getting shot up, or when you're seeing, this injustice happen or that injustice happen, I need to know that you're not thinking of a people, you're thinking of a person. That when I think about Black Lives Matter, I'm not thinking about Black lives. No. I'm thinking about, my friend Christy Williams. I'm thinking about my friend Quraysh. I'm thinking about my cousin Sammy, like who I'm part Moroccan, right? And Moroccans are on the spectrum, right? You have you have white as white like me. I'm blending in with my shirt a little bit. And then you have my cousin who is the darkest of the dark, right? That's how Moroccans are, Northern Africans, you know. So when I think of Black Lives Matter, I'm thinking about my own blood, When I'm thinking about, Jewish rights, I'm thinking about my friends, my colleagues. When I'm thinking about Christian rights, I'm thinking about my friends, my colleagues. When I'm thinking about, white America, a lot of times we like to say that white privilege and this, that, and the other, but there is, we live in Oklahoma, right? So we see the other side of white America too, right? We don't just see the California side, we see the Oklahoma side of white America. That I think about those people too. That when I'm driving to Turner Falls and I'm seeing broken roads and I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that, I'm thinking like, where's my government at? Why aren't they helping these people? And so that's what justice looks like to us. And when it comes to economic justice, as I mentioned, our religion has very strict rules that don't do this and don't do this and don't do this, And so when you ask and you gave the prompt for us, what does our religion do to change? I mean, our religion says get rid of it. You got to get rid of the virus. If the virus is still there, it's never going to get better. That's just the reality. And so what I do for my own community is, I preach and I encourage for us to pick up the slack. That way we can stand before God on the day of judgment and we can say, God, I did my best. I didn't live in a perfect society, but I did my best to make it better.
Okay.
And God knows best.
Thank you, Imam. Rabbi?
I think also, Imam, thank you so much, because that's obviously you are very passionate about this. And with my, I hold kind of dual roles at Temple Israel, right? I'm one of the rabbis and I'm the director of education. So with my educator lens on, one of the things that and since we're here on a series, hopefully helping out some families and some kids with some questions here, one of the things I was reminded about as we were starting this school year, this very, very different environment for our students, that when we think about education, we're usually thinking about retention and what they remember and continuity and things like that. And what I stressed this year more so than any other was that no, first and foremost, we content isn't going to mean quite as much if we're not taking stock of where we are. And I saw this hashtag on social media that was going around that said Maslow before Bloom, that we need to be cognizant of Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we start going into Bloom's taxonomy and trying to get through any content. And the very base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is making sure, like Imam, like you were talking about, that you've got food, clothing, shelter, that your basic needs are taken care of. And any of those other pieces about interpersonal relationships, about spiritual development, any of those other pieces, you can't work on those until you know that your base and your foundation of those essential needs are met. And I think as an educator, that's a really big thing for me, is that we have to make sure that those basic needs are met. And then on top of that, we also need to make sure that basic need of human relationships, right? That as Imam was talking about, that, when I think of Black Lives Matter, I think of not people generally, but my people, my specific people. When I think about other, issues of hatred and racism. I think about specific individuals and creating those connections and creating and fostering those relationships. That's the way you enact change, because that's then the people power that you can capitalize on, for lack of a better word, in order to create the larger change that Imam was talking about. None of us individually are going to be able to go to bat and change local, state, or national laws. It's only when we can create connections like we're doing right now, giving spaces to questions and issues and showing you how it really affects people, that we're able to do that.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Reverend or Christy, do you want to add anything to this topic? Go ahead, Rev.
Sometimes even the best intentioned people, people with their hearts in the right place, get depressed and feel overwhelmed by so many things that are wrong and unjust and think, well, what can I do? Well, I can't do anything. I'm just me. So I guess I'll go make some mashed potatoes for dinner and tomorrow's another day. When I think perhaps the power of this conversation and any kind of conversation between people who want to make the world a better place and want to use their spiritual path to bring about tikkun olam. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. Where
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, yay, where the world is set right, more or less. It's when we do get together that change can happen. And I'm of the age where most people my age and a little bit younger find themselves saying, I don't believe in organized religion. And I always say, well, believe it because it's real. But I don't want to do organized religion. And a girlfriend of mine who changed her mind about this eventually, but she would always say, I can feel as close to God sitting out on my back patio smoking a Marlboro Red on a Sunday morning as I can, and this is a pen, obviously. Anyway, as I can sitting in a church congregation. And that's great. I don't smoke, but I feel very close to God out in nature also. But what you lack when you're just doing it on your own is the community and the strengths that you can share. Anytime I've led a mission trip, as we call it, to another part of the country or once to Bolivia, in that Bolivia trip, I had 17 people, some of whom had medical training, some had construction training, and some were just really nice, good listener kind of people. And all of those skills put together helped us do some pretty amazing things for a little village that had no medical clinic and had no public bathroom. So we installed toilets for a little village and gave them all medical care until the next time. And we couldn't have done that if I'd just gone down there by myself. I could have used my tiny little skill set to do a few good things, but the power of 17 people working together made a big change. So the power of 500 people working together makes an enormous change. So we can't do it alone.
Thank you, Rev. Christy, you want to add to that before we move on our last 15 minutes?
Well, I always say, that God is not in politics. I always feel like, God is saying that's something that y'all made up. I'll be over here when you're done. And and I really just believe that. And even in when we speak about, just being advocates for our community, I do believe that God exists in that, in building and just, helping your neighbor. I think that's where God exists. And I do, I'm an Ifa devotee, and we're not it's not a religion. It's a spiritual system. It's a spiritual way of life. It is spiritual wisdom to help you get through life and beyond. And it is of three components. Of it's God, who we call Olodumare, our ancestors, and the Orishas. I often tell people, just like in Christianity, you have angels, we have our ancestors, we have Orishas, when I try to explain it that way, but it is an old sacred spiritual system. And it's hard to talk about because it's all oral, pretty much of oral history being spoken, and it has to be in sacred places to even talk about it in detail. But I do think that we lack a spiritual context to the system that we live under. And I try to imagine if we had or use our spiritual context in this political system, the better decisions, the better policies we would make. But when you see the people who are in those positions, as I said, you see God just doesn't exist there. It's crazy. And sometimes when I see people who make these horrible policies and just very oppressive on people, and then I see them in a church, it's like, for Black people seeing the KKK in a church, you're like, what is this? So it's a really fine line when it comes to that. It's a really, really fine line.
Thank you. And thank you, Christy, for introducing Ifa, because that's what I was going to try and do next before we run out of time, was for you all to share sort of origin stories, and thinking about the origin stories, or an origin story, because you can't tell more than one. We only have a few minutes left, but thinking about it in the context of the season that we are in, and the significance of this period of time for your practice, for your faith. And we have roughly about 12 minutes. So I'm going to ask you all, although you're all eloquent and lovely, and I can listen to all of you all day, to kind of keep it in the 3-minute range there. Anyone like to go first?
I can start off because I think I'll be really quick, which seems to be against my nature. But I'll be really quick. For us as Muslims, this specific time doesn't have any significance. We work based off of the lunar calendar, and so it's actually changing kind of throughout as the years kind of go by. We have two main holidays. They're both called Eid, Eid al-Adha and then Eid al-Fitr. Eid al-Fitr, we celebrate the completion of the month of Ramadan, where we spend a month devoting ourselves to improving our relationship with God, and we fast the entire month. Obviously, we break our fast at night, but we fast every day for that month. And then we have Eid al-Adha, which is celebrating the tradition of Abraham. And I think that kind of perfectly leads into the quote unquote origin story and what we believe as Muslims. I think one of the most common misconceptions of Islam is that Islam started with the Prophet Muhammad, which is absolutely not the case at all. As Muslims, we believe that Islam started with Adam, the first ever human being, and that we hold true to the tradition of believing in one God and only one God, and that God then sent down prophets to teach us as humanity how to worship him. And he taught Adam that, and Noah that, and Abraham that, and Ishmael and Isaac and Moses, and David and Solomon and Jesus and Jonah, etc., 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 that we believe in all of these prophets. And as a matter of fact, that Muhammad is simply a continuation of a family and a legacy of prophets, and that Islam did not start with him. And that legacy preaches one and one thing only, and that is believe in one and only one God, worship one and only one God, and prepare yourself for the day of judgment.
Thank you, Imam. Yeah, I think I may have shaken some people up yesterday on Good Morning Tulsa when I said that the name of the prophet Jesus appears more often in the Quran than it does in the Bible. I think folks didn't know how to handle that. Rabbi, go ahead.
Sure. So interestingly enough, as Imam just said this isn't a specifically, religious time in their calendar. Judaism kind of bridges the gap between that. Our calendar is a lunisolar calendar. So it's a lunar-based calendar that then makes accommodations for the solar calendar so that our holidays, which a lot of which are focused on agricultural pieces, fall in the right season. It is not our biggest time of the year in terms of holidays. That happens in the fall with our high holy days and the beginning of our new year. So, interestingly enough, Hanukkah currently happening, usually happens around this time of year, is actually one of our more minor holidays. It became a much bigger holiday, calling back to what we were just talking about with, its proximity to Christmas and capitalism and pieces like that. But in the Jewish calendar, it's a relatively minor holiday. It's also not biblical. You don't find references to Hanukkah in the Torah or in the books of the prophets or the writings, what we collectively call the Tanakh. It's actually an extra canonical text, an apocryphal text, the book of the Maccabees, where we find the origins of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah, in terms of some of what we were talking about before, Hanukkah is about holding on to one of the pieces about Hanukkah is about holding on to your status as a minority in a majority culture, right? So how do you hold on to those pieces that make you who you are? And don't lose that in sight of people who are trying to tell you not to do that. So Hanukkah is about, standing on your own 2 feet and really kind of saying, no, this is who I am and that's okay. And so I think one of those things for me that is, while it is a minor holiday, one of those things that's really important about it this time of year is that perspective that this is about autonomy in some ways, and that this is about how do we interact when everything around us is telling us no, or telling us don't do that. And how do we still stand in self-reliance and self-resilience to be able to say, this is who I am, and nothing is going to change that for me or about me, that I get to be my own person. And it's really important in some ways to think about that as there was a debate about whether you start with the Hanukkah completely filled up and diminish the light over the time, or you start with one candle and you increase the light over the time. This is one of the major debates in the Talmud about Hanukkah from 2 of our sage rabbis, Hillel and Shammai. And the result ended up being that we start with a little and we increase it over time because we need to increase that light. We need to bring it into the world. There's a reason Hanukkah happens at the darkest time of the year. Our responsibility is to bring that light and awareness and that assistance to other people who can't do that. That's why you publicize it. That's why when you light the Hanukkah, the Hanukkah menorah, one of the pieces about Hanukkah is you're supposed to put it in the window so that other people can see it, so that they're reminded too, or that they start to ask questions about it as well.
Thank you for that. That was beautifully stated. Christy, were you going to share? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So in E5 we do not celebrate Christmas. It just does not exist at all. But I did grow up in a household where we believed that the fat white man Santa was coming bringing us gifts, right? And so that's how I grew up. But as I had children, we did that for a little bit. But then when I really learned what Kwanzaa was about, it means more to me. And even though I have a tree, my kids have Christmas, but we do practice Kwanzaa. And it is one of the most beautiful things ever. It's not a religion. It's just something that Milana Karenga, is it Karenga? I always mess it up.
Milana Ron Karenga.
Yeah, put together in the 60s, in the late 60s. And it is the most beautiful thing. And I wish that Black people could really do this faithfully every year. Each day, I mean, it starts December 26th, ends on New Year's, January 1st. And it's Umoja, which means unity, Kujichagulia, which means self-determination, Ujamaa, collective work and responsibility, Nia, which is my favorite, purpose, Kumba, creativity, and Imani, faith. And what I love about those is that each day you practice that with your family, or you do some type of event or activity that makes your children think about unity, learning about self-determination and collective work and responsibility. And it gets hard because you have to be really creative to come up with ways to really instill that in your children. So just imagine if those principles were more important than presents, and what you put into your children. Think of the human beings that you are bringing into this world, and that you're leaving here to build, and how better they would be. I get inspired every year at Kwanzaa. Rudisa Library, Alicia Lattimore puts on a beautiful Kwanzaa celebration. I've never missed one, and it's going to be virtual this year. It's going to be different. But Chief Ugunwale Amishan, he hosts the Kwanzaa celebration, and it is beautiful when community comes together and practice this. But I really wish that it was something that our culture would really accept as the main holiday for the year, and really just put life into it, because it is powerful. It is very powerful.
Yeah, I experienced many and participated in many Kwanzaa celebrations in Chicago before I moved back here, and have been hungry for Kwanzaa. So let's build about that later. Rev, you have the last word.
Okay, super fast. Christmas, celebrating the birth of Jesus, who Christians see as the Messiah. And we kind of think maybe he was actually born in September. Hopefully I didn't cause big problems saying that among our Christian listeners.
Too late, Rev. You've already ruined folks' lives now. You know that, right?
Yeah, I quit preaching and went to meddling now again. So, because Mary and Joseph were on their way to go be counted in the census, and we think that probably would have happened not in December, but as Christianity was kind of taking a place in Western civilization, there was a Greco-Roman holiday called Saturnalia, kind of a pagan celebration that celebrated the return of light after the darkest night on December 21st or so. And so Saturnalia and Christmas just kind of overlapped. And so now we celebrate Christmas at this late December time. Christmas really theologically is slightly secondary to Easter, which is less of a cultural big deal in this country, but Easter is the home run #1 thing about Christianity, where the resurrection of Jesus Christ is celebrated. But we don't have all the cultural shopping and parties and celebrations that go along with it. So Christmas winds up kind of being a bigger deal. And Saint Nicholas, who ended up being the white man coming down the chimney, Santa Claus comes from Saint Nicholas, who was born in Greece but lived in Turkey, I think in the 6th century AD, CE. And there are lots of stories about him. He either went door to door leaving money for people who were poor, or there's another story that says there were 3 young, probably teenage daughters who were going to be sold into prostitution. And so he went and paid a dowry for them so that their father would have enough money so that he didn't have to sell them off into that kind of slavery. And he evidently threw it through an open window, and was anonymous about it, but then they attributed to that. So somehow we get from a Turkish bishop throwing money through the window to save young girls from a terrible fate to a fat man coming down a very, very narrow hole in your roof that's dangerous to leave you presents. So it all comes from a good place about generosity to those who are in a terrible spot in their lives.
That's a one. Thank you for breaking that down, Rev. I had read some of that history about the relationship to Turkey, and the saving the young women from being sold. But I didn't know all of that, all of those details. So it's fascinating how we got from that story, from that history, from that truth to the commercial buying gifts, and folks getting depressed and losing their minds trying to make people happy with things they can't afford and so on. I don't know how we get there. Like, even the Easter bunny makes more sense in the store, in the trajectory of the commercialization of holidays, or Christian observances, I should say. The Easter bunny makes more sense than Santa Claus. I don't know how we got there, I don't know. And thank you all. This has been amazing. I've learned a great deal, and I thought I knew something. Betty, go ahead.
I just want to thank everybody. It was great. Quraysh, as always, you were great. I want to thank OSU Tulsa, Tri-City Collective, Quraysh, and this panel was amazing. I could have listened to you all day. I learned so much, and we really appreciate that you took the time to educate us. And I think it's interesting that this is not actually a huge holiday for any of us, or it shouldn't be. It's become a commercial holiday, and I learned from all of you, we need to be more about community and giving, and being aware of the difficulties that those around us deal with every day. So thank you so much. And I hope you will join us January 20th. We'll be talking about Beyond. I Have a Dream, about Martin Luther King Jr. and what he meant in our lives. But thank you, thank you, thank you. And we appreciate you.
Thank you all very much. Have a great day. And thanks for watching.
Thank you guys for having us.